Legendary music producer Don McKinnon was just 15 years old when he developed what would become a lifelong fascination with making music mixtapes.
Songs were sort of trapped on vinyl. There were albums were on vinyl, and that's where the songs lived. And there were radio DJs who mixed it up and played different songs from different albums on shows. But the ability to sit down and sort of liberate those songs from their albums and create something new was fascinating to me.
Little did McKinnon know it, but that simple idea of creating mixtapes to share his passion for music and curation would lead him to revolutionize the music industry and how you discover, listen, share, and build your community around music today. And that's whether you're browsing through iTunes or standing at your local Starbucks, shazamming some unknown artist as you wait for your iced caramel latte. Hello, everyone. I'm Chitra Ragavan. Welcome to the 52nd and final episode of Season 2 of When It Mattered. This episode is brought to you by Good Story, an advisory firm helping technology startups with brand positioning and narrative. Joining me today to talk about the mixtape of his life and career is Don McKinnon. He's the former founder and CEO of Hear Music, an innovative music retailer featuring the first CD-based listening stations, which he sold to Starbucks and developed that company's strategic music platform, releasing more than 300 eclectic CD compilations. Don also created the Hear Music label, which released the triple platinum Grammy Award-winning Ray Charles compilation, Genius Loves Company, Rolling Stone's Rarities 1971 to 2003, and Bob Dylan's iconic first recordings of Live at the Gaslight. McKinnon also was instrumental, so to speak, in building one of the most famous global corporate social responsibility platforms for Product Red. That's the organization that Bono and Bobby Schreiber created to help fight AIDS in Africa. McKinnon brought in artists including Coldplay, Jay-Z, Lady Gaga, Katy Perry, Usher, and dozens more to the platform. Now, McKinnon is about to transform how you discover, curate, and build community through podcasts, using the same concept he pioneered in music. What else but mixtapes? Tomorrow, he's unveiling his new stealth podcast curation platform called Hark. Here to tell us more about his life and times and about Hark is Don McKinnon. Don, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Chitra. It's great to be here. I'm the season finale. This is amazing. But thanks for that intro. That's great.
So do you remember how the idea of mixtapes came up when you were in high school?
So, I think it must be that every generation kind of thinks they're at a magic, they're at like a pivotal moment in the history of technology evolution. But I do remember loving, I just remember making them. And I remember the act of making them. And for many younger listeners, it may seem crazy to talk about it, right? Because we could just sort of drag and drop songs wherever we want in Spotify. And what is Spotify but some giant mixtape? But there was a time, when we walked to school in the snow. And there was a time when, songs were sort of trapped on vinyl. There were albums were on vinyl, and that's where the songs lived. And there were radio DJs who mixed it up and played different songs from different albums on shows. But the ability to sit down and sort of liberate those songs from their albums and create something new was fascinating to me. And it took time, right? So again, for folks who even, like not quite as young listeners who remember making mix CDs, where again, you could sort of drop a digital file. It happened in real time. So you had to plan it out. I remember sitting on the floor of my room with the records spread out, organizing them and, making notes about the order I wanted to have the songs appear in. And as you recorded it, you drop the needle on the song and it's recording it in real time onto the tape. And while you're doing that, you're writing liner notes, which are, because the beauty of a mixtape is you end up with an artifact, a physical thing you can give to someone. And, the beauty of a mixtape is you're helping them discover something new, and you're giving them a lens through which to approach it. So part one is you need to name your mixtape. It needs to have a clever title that's a theme, right? Whether it's breakup songs or driving music or whatever, you have a concept for it, and you need to come up with a clever name. And then for each song, you're writing that little couple of notes on this little cardboard folded Maxell insert for the cassette that for each song tells the person you're giving it to why you chose that song and how to listen to it. And so I just absolutely loved making them. And they were, and in many ways, that activity, I think, has informed kind of my approach to helping people discover music and now podcasts.
So where was this? Tell me a little bit about where you were born and where you went to school, and geographically, where was all this happening?
I was born in New Jersey. I grew up in Short Hills, New Jersey. I went away to high school. I went to boarding school in Connecticut at a school called Choate, and Choate Rosemary Hall. And I found myself with a bunch of other friends who I was learning about music from, much the way all high school students learn about music. But we really loved sort of adopting this ability to construct something that would sort of be something you could hold in your hand and listen to as an experience.
And so tell us a little bit about the music that you included in those mixtapes, your early music interests. Were they always eclectic?
They certainly got more eclectic as I got through college. And, it is, so I would say I started as a big REM fan. This is the early to mid 80s. But I loved Laurie Anderson and Lou Reed, who to me were different artists, but who ended up marrying each other. And I would see them walking their dog in the West Village later in my life. I was obsessed with Tom Waits. Of all the artists I went on to interview when I did hear music, the Rolling Stones, etc. Tom Waits was the one I was the most excited about. But I also, found my way to, I loved the Goldberg variations by Bach, done by Glenn Gould, who you could hear singing a little bit when he was playing. He recorded them twice. And in the 1982, which he re-recorded them at the end of his life, you could kind of hear him singing a little bit while he was doing it. That's a fun question, right? To ask me what I was listening to then, because music discovery was harder. It was more expensive. It took more time and research. You had to read magazines and ask friends, and then you had to go to the record store and take a chance and plop down significant money to buy a record. And it also meant that you listened to an album all the way through and savored all of the tracks, or tried to savor all of the tracks, as opposed to what we have today, which is, the concept of the album is getting eroded.
You also loved writing, I guess, in magazines, and you were, without even knowing it at the time, bringing all of these passions together with these liner notes that you were, I think, lovingly writing. And it seemed like a real sort of a combination of things that you cared about that you were bringing together into what would eventually be a kind of this revolutionary idea.
Yeah, I did love making magazines, and I made a couple of different magazines in high school and college. I partnered with a friend, Pat, to create a sort of a current affairs, more politically oriented one. But my favorite one that we did was called Route 2, that I did in college. I went to Williams College. Route 2 goes through Williams College, but there were more associations than that. If you think about it, when you're making a magazine, you're also sort of collaging an experience together that you're going to allow them to go through, right? You're sort of creating a narrative that they're going to go through, more than websites are today. And, a great magazine is an experience of serendipity, right? It isn't about, you don't get a magazine and go look at the table of contents and just go to page 97. A great magazine is a magazine that you actually move through. And the best magazines are organized where you're sort of led into the experience. Think about the New Yorker starting with to the talk of the town or goings on about town, and then moving further into it. So I did love that about magazines, and mixtapes, you could say, are the most sort of control freak version of that, right? Where I'm giving you something that you're going to listen to in a sequence, and while you're listening, you're going to read the companion text that we have with it. And this may be where you're going, but I really do feel like those two pursuits that seem very different, making mixtapes and making magazines, actually were very similar inspirations in my mind. And they were about trying to kind of create an interactive experience that there wasn't really the technology to do yet.
And that also kind of intertwined when you were in college or about to graduate and took you on your next sort of path towards creating a more concrete life around music. And that was when you kind of had a setback as you were graduating and looking for work.
Oh, yeah. I had this great experience, which is I was so happy. I got a job very early in senior year. I was going to write for 7 Days magazine, which, raise your hand out there if you remember 7 Days magazine, but it's a bit of a legendary magazine. It was, writing about culture in New York and in New York City. It was edited by Adam Moss, who now does the New Yorker. The New York magazine. And so I laughed at all my friends senior year of college while they took the LSATs and interviewed with consulting firms or investment banks and said, no, I've got a job writing for my dream magazine living in New York City. And then in the spring, they had their funding pulled. They'd been around for 10 years. They actually won the Magazine of the Year award for general excellence that year after they had sort of gone under. So I suddenly, it was April or March, found myself without what I was going to do next. And that sort of led to the creation of Hear Music.
Tell me how that came about.
So I had worked the summer before at Time Magazine as an intern and met a friend named Andrew McKee, who was at Harvard Business School between first and second year. And he and a fellow student, Kevin Sheehan, had done the spring business plan competition. And they were looking at the music industry and how adults were how hard it was to discover music and how so much of the music industry focused on sort of the top 40. And I started collaborating with them, even though I wasn't going to school with them in the spring, on this idea for a magazine / catalog that would recommend music. And so when 7 Days went away, I decided to join forces with them, and we founded Hear Music. That business plan actually won the competition, and then we founded Hear Music the day after I graduated from Williams, June 18th, 1990.
Well, I guess creating a catalog is easier said than done, right? Especially this was pre-internet. And how did you go about it? And what were some of the challenges you faced?
Yeah, so I feel like, I often say Hear Music, which went through all these evolutions, was kind of a format in search of a medium, and the format was very much, inspired by the work, the idea of the mixtape, that you could listen to music in a serendipitous way and discover things, and the narrative experience of an immersive visual experience of an editorial experience of a magazine. So we created these beautiful magazines. When I years later met Bob Dylan's manager, as I was talking to him, I saw on his bookshelf, he had the Hear Music catalogs all in a row wedged in there. So that was great catharsis, delayed reaction catharsis. I approached making it a little bit like a mixtape in a magazine. I organized each of the spreads had a theme, whether it was songwriters that could be novelists, or the birth of bebop, or Amateur Night at the Apollo. And then I would also interview my favorite artists about the music they thought people should be listening to. Early interviews I did were like John Lee Hooker and Ry Cooder. And then that, went on to John Prine, who passed away last year. And just, an incredible array of my musical heroes who loved participating in this project of trying to help people discover the music that they loved. And many of those artists talked about the same artists, Lyle Lovett and many other artists would talk about Willis Allen Ramsey, who I had never heard of. And Chitra, have you ever heard of Willis Allen Ramsey? There you go. So Willis Allen Ramsey made one unbelievable record in 1972 and was one of those seminal, influential artists on so many of these folks that they were able to cast back at. But to your point about interactivity, we were doing everything we could. And I think part of what, it was like an education trying to do this thing as a catalog at first, the artist choice influences and how do you get people to want to discover something that they don't know. The mission of Hear Music was, how do I get you beyond the top 40? How do I help you want to hear something different? And one example of what we tried to do was, I interviewed Ry Cooder, the great guitarist and genius musician, and he said, what I think everyone should listen to is a blues musician from Mali called Ali Farka Touré. And I said, okay, well, you got to explain why they're going to want to hear that. How would you recommend that to a friend? And he said, well, Ali Farka Touré is like John Lee Hooker played backwards. And I said, that's great. And so we blew it up really big in the catalog and it was beautiful. And people would call in and say, okay, I'm almost ready to take a chance on that, but what does it really sound like? And we were in Boston, we had all Berklee School of Music students working for us, and they would go, hold on, and they would run into the warehouse, grab the CD, put it into a boombox, and hold the phone up to the boombox. And that was our version of on-demand streaming in 1992 and 3, which was, you can see we were doing everything we could to kind of create an interactive experience. So that's sort of all the work we were doing to make catalogs work. But at the end of the day, it's an incredibly capital intensive business. And, so it's that entrepreneur's dilemma where, both of my original partners had left. Lisa Larman, who was another founder, who was the creative director, who we eventually got married and became husband and wife. And we had all these amazing people working for us doing this catalog. And we could just tell, like, we were trying to do this, but the limitations of the format were holding us back. And so that's what led us to feeling like we needed to make a change. And, for those of you listening who are saying, the internet, there was no internet yet. It was too early. So that's what led to creating the Hear Music stores.
Yeah, you kind of said to me that you were actually dreaming of the internet without knowing what it was, right? You had this great idea, but you just didn't know how to get it to people in the scope and scale you wanted to get it to people.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you kind of track the shifts for Hear Music, it's like we created a magazine that was as interactive as we possibly could. We literally created 800 numbers you could call in and put in a code and listen to 30 seconds of the song. And we just sort of did everything we could with that format. And then we said, let's create a store, but make it essentially as interactive an environment as we can and as graphic and editorial an environment as we can. So again, this sounds absurd to listeners in the present day, thinking about where we are with technology. But at the time, we created the first music stores that had listening stations in them in North America, or in the United States. My mother likes to point out that in Toronto, Canada, when she was growing up, she could go into a store and she could put an album in, she'd go into a little booth. But, that idea of an interactive listening station was something that hadn't been done. We really tried to make the store an experience that you walked through. Like, people have described the Hear Music stores as sort of a combination of a Copenhagen coffee house, Japanese sushi bar, and like the best indie bookstore and sort of an art gallery or a museum. So as you walked through, it was like you were walking through the pages of the magazine. So here is David Byrne recommending the music he thinks you should be listening to from Cuba. And as you walk through, here's Yo-Yo Ma helping you get into the music of the classical period. And here's an entire vault on how, the best of 50s jazz. And so that real sense of curation. So it wasn't just about having listening stations, but was around making a store that I don't think there's ever been a store before or since that had more words on its walls than that store, than those stores did. And sort of using graphics to sort of help people go places. We had, as you walked in, there was a beautiful rotunda with a plaster wall. And Lisa, the creative director, made actual slides, physical slides. So we would pick for each song that played, I would pick a lyric, or we would write a little few sentences about it. And she would make slides that were just projecting beautiful white type on the wall. So it looked like somebody had gone up and painted the quote on the wall, and people would walk in and sort of look at it. And then the song would change and the slide would change, and people would look up and say, wait, how did that happen? So it was all, and we had motorcycle taillights under the CDs that we're playing. And so all of this was super fun to do. And again, sort of trying to build another form of interactivity. And I think all these kind of training wheels of interactivity meant that when we finally got the internet, we were, to the point of your question, we brought more to it, I think. I think it was helpful to have gone through those phases. Lisa herself, who had been, before we met, the designer of a number of music magazines, Musician Magazine, she redesigned Cream magazine. She is of that generation, the last of the generation designers who were taught doing paste up, physical paste up of design, right, before computers. And she actually took the job with Hear Music because we were going to buy her a Macintosh and train, let her learn Quark, which was the design program. And she also feels strongly that learning analog allows you, when you get the freedom of digital, to be smarter.
How many stores did you have, and how did you make this all happen? Physically, financially? It sounds like a labor of love, but a massive undertaking.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the most pivotal meetings of my life, we were in Boston, and we went and met with a man named Charles Layton, who owned a company called CML, which was sort of a holding company they owned Boston Whaler and Nordic Track and Smith and Hawken and Nature Company. And Smith and Hawken and Nature Company were companies that had stores and catalogs. And so we went, and I was pitching him in a big sort of Trading Places picture, kind of very severe businessy boardroom. And I'm pitching this man on, yes, we're doing these catalogs, but I have a vision for creating an interactive retail environment. And he started smiling and kept smiling. And then he interrupted me and said, Don, I would like to fly you to California to meet with a person who, whether you end up working together or not, will be one of your favorite people ever. And his name is Richard Altoona. Richard is one of the greatest retail designers in the history of that discipline. He designed the NBA store in New York, Patagonia stores, every Restoration Hardware and Pottery Barn and Williams-Sonoma you were ever in, like all of those stores he did. He said, well, if we're going to think about interactivity, we have to go to Paris. I said, okay, I'm up for Paris. But because there was nowhere to he said, because we have to think about how interactivity works in a retail environment. And so we went to Paris, and first it's an interesting quick story. We went to Virgin Megastore, which had a bank of listening stations with the hits, right? So you could listen to the new Madonna record, and you could listen to the new Mariah Carey record. And then there were acres of CDs and bins that you couldn't listen to. And so that didn't seem right. This is sort of a Goldilocks story. Then we went to a really beautiful store called Fnac, F-N-A-C, which feels like you're in a houseware store, like a home. It feels almost like a residential environment. And then there would be a cushy chair with headphones, and there was one CD on repeat at a table. And we sat there for a minute, and that didn't feel right. And he said, this isn't right. We have to go to Frankfurt. So we flew to Frankfurt. And in Frankfurt, at the top of a very traditional department store, there was a very stripped down record store. And above every bin, there was a shelf. And on the shelf, there was a single disc changer with one CD on repeat. And what was interesting about it was, as people shopped, wherever they were, they would just take the headphone and put the headphones on and listen for about 6 seconds. And then they would either take them off or they would look up and grab that CD, right? So that for me is the serendipity. It's serendipity versus discovery as work, right? And so they found their way to something they never would have found. And that inspired us when we built the first Hear Music store. We actually built it. Our idea was that we were going to have single disc players. And then while we were building it, Sony came out with a cheap enough 10-disc CD changer. Again, your younger listeners have no idea what I'm talking about. That allowed us to go buy these and solder. We bought buttons at Radio Shack and literally screwed buttons onto the shelves and soldered them back to these 10-disc changers. And we opened this store, and people came in, and a number of people over the first months said, "Where is the computer?" Right? They thought there was a giant hard drive in the back of the store. There was so again, it's that sense of trying to create a sense of magic around using, analog, so that when you ultimately get the magic technology of the internet and everything, you have a better sense of how to use it.
And so you were starting to get a lot of attention around these stores, and then you had an interesting call, I guess, or visit from Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz.
Right. So, I think just quickly, so the first store we ever built was on 4th Street in Berkeley. We built a store at the Stanford Shopping Center in Palo Alto that Steve Jobs shopped at regularly. And when I met Steve Jobs years later, and I had them send me, fax me the receipts, so that I kind of know what Steve Jobs bought over those many years. So when I finally, Howard Schultz introduced me to Steve Jobs, and, he said, "I know, it's Hear Music, my favorite store." And I said, "And you love Ennio Morricone." So it was kind of fun to break privacy for the man who, created our lack of privacy. No. And so, Stanford Shopping Center, Santa Monica, and those stores were able to truly drive demand on music that otherwise was, sort of left out of the equation. And so we allowed us to have a much different, that was incredibly valuable, that we were able to take a band that maybe wasn't being played on the radio or anywhere else and make it our kind of top seller. And that was great for the musicians, but it was also great for the customers who would come in and walk away with something that, really felt like they had discovered something new. And I think that plays into what we'll talk about with Hark and podcasters too. So one day I got this call from Howard Schultz. We built a store on Russian Oak in Chicago, the corner of Russian Oak. And we had built it next door at the same time as a really beautiful flagship Starbucks store. And Howard Schultz called up and said, I don't know if you know, we have a store next to each other. And I was like, I have many fewer stores than you have. I'm aware. And he said, the big thing that the customers are asking to do, all the comments are that they want to knock down the wall between the Starbucks and the Hear Music store, and they want to integrate the experience. And so that was a pretty good opener. I flew up, at that point we were based in San Francisco, and I flew up to Seattle, and that conversation led to Starbucks acquiring Hear Music. This is 1999, the internet bubble is going like crazy. And a lot of our investors were saying, hey, let's go raise a bunch of money and go on the internet. But the internet was still, we had just gone from 14.4 modems to 28.8 modems. It was still very slow, very hard to deliver that full experience there. And then when I got a call from Howard, I was like, look at this beautiful thing, right? They're playing, there was a great team there, Timothy and Holly and David, who were playing incredibly great music for people. And like one of the top questions to the baristas was always, excuse me, what is this song that's playing? And the ability to take that incredible that sort of serendipitous moment and start creating real mixtapes, right? This takes us back to high school, right? Everything had been an approximation, but here we can create compilations and really, mixtape at scale. And it was really, really fun.
So tell me about your role at Starbucks. I guess you built their whole strategic platform for this kind of curated, serendipitous experience around music.
Yeah, as I said, there were great folks there: Timothy Jones, Holly Hinton, and David Brewster, who had started the kind of they were playing. It was very focused on jazz and world music, and I felt like there was a way to sort of scale that. And so it was around, we built sort of the compilations you saw. So artist choice CDs. On my 35th birthday, we interviewed the Rolling Stones, one after another, an hour each, about their favorite music for their Hear Music Artist Choice CD, which was an unbelievable experience. And opus collections, where we would take an artist like Etta James and create a sort of our own mixtape of the best moments from her career. And again, this was at a time where the physical distribution of music was going away, but digital hadn't really scaled yet. So there was a real magic, that was sort of a magic moment where, Starbucks was at sort of the perfect place to collapse marketing, like discovery and distribution in the same act. And it was incredible. We did, not only do we make the compilations, we put in the Wi-Fi networks. So I remember going to a meeting where the operators were saying the customers wanted more phone jacks that you could, if you remember that. Starbucks put in Wi-Fi, which enabled an entire whole nother level of experiences there. We did the Hear Music XM75 satellite radio station, which is now the coffee house station if you have Sirius XM. But yeah, all sorts of amazing stuff.
So we have to get some stories from you on what it was like to interview every member of the Rolling Stones on your 35th birthday.
Oh, so they were in Toronto. They were preparing for the world tour of 40 Licks. They were all living they had the entire top floor of the Four Seasons. The team took me and Tim Ziegler, who did the interview, to a suite at the end of the hall and brought them in one by one. And they each sort of have their own manager. So we had been faxed separate lists by each of the people. So for each of them. So none of them had seen what the others had picked, which is sort of funny. And so, of course, Charlie Watts came in first and said, I just want to make sure I didn't choose Chuck Berry because I assumed Mick and Keith would choose Chuck Berry, and lo and behold, neither of them had, and he got very upset. Mick was incredible, and there were really surprising picks. Mick chose a song by Sade, and that's sort of not what you would think Mick Jagger would put. And then when Ron Wood came in, and they each had sort of a rider for like what would be moved into the room before they came. For Charlie Watts, it was a big pot of coffee. For Mick Jagger, it was 2 wine goblets filled with cranberry juice. For Ronnie Wood, it was a giant ashtray. And for Keith Richards, it was 2 bottles of Stolichnaya with can of Orange Crush open. So, but when Ron Wood came in, he immediately said, I need to see everyone's picks. And he looked at Charlie's list, and Charlie had chosen a song by Earl Bostic, which I'm not sure any of your listeners have heard of Earl Bostic. I had never heard of Earl Bostic. Earl Bostic was sort of a pop R&B saxophone player from the 50s, I think, or the 60s. He got very upset. Ron Wood said, we cannot have Earl Bostic on this compilation. This is our legacy. And he said, come with me. And he starts running down the hall. And so we follow him down the hall, and he starts pounding on Charlie Watts's door. And I am just trying to have the interview not end. And he's saying, Earl, I won't say the word, I don't know, but Earl effing Bostic, are you kidding me? And shouting at the door. And finally, and I'm thinking the managers are going to make us go away and everything. But finally, Charlie Watts opens his door, sort of like Lurch, and looks down at Ron Wood with a withering stare and says, "I'll have you know, when I was 9 years old, I heard Earl Bostic, and it inspired me to roll up a newspaper in the shape of a saxophone and paint it yellow. So F you," and hangs the door, slams the door in his face. And it was an amazing moment. And Ron Wood said, "Okay." And then we went back down the hall, and that's my Rolling Stone story.
It's incredible the access you had and to all of these great musicians, and what an education it must have been.
Yeah, it was. It was beautiful. Like, I have a lot of friends who are music journalists who have interviewed many of the same people, but it is different. It's a different conversation. Musicians talking about, well, this is my latest album, and they sort of have a formula they fall into when they get into press mode, and they're talking about their new record, and they have a little hard drive of quotes about it. And there's a great moment where they realize, when we interviewed Lou Reed in his apartment in the West Village, he was very unwelcoming. We were in his home, but he was very, there's a lot of stories of Lou Reed, and we were about to live one of those mean Lou Reed stories. And he started just talking about the new record that he was making. And I interrupted him and said, listen, that's not what this is. This is about, what music do you wish people would hear? And he said, "Can I talk about doo-wop?" And we said, "Yeah, absolutely." And he was like, "Okay, can I make you some tea?" And he started putting on doo-wop records and playing them at top volume. And it was just incredible. So, I feel like I created my dream job, and it was a dream.
What was it like to interview Tom Waits?
So I think I said earlier, I've interviewed all these amazing people, but like Tom Waits is the one that I was the most nervous about, and that I wanted the most. And Tim, who did many of the interviews with me, I think felt the same way. And he was on a major label, and we couldn't get to him for a long time. And then he switched to an indie label, and we were able to get to his wife, Kathleen, who said that he said, "Oh, this just sounds like doing the SATs." But he told us to meet him at a truck stop in Sebastopol, which is up north of San Francisco and near Sonoma, and which was like we were suddenly in a Wim Wenders film, like Paris, Texas, like the perfect truck stop with the perfect little cafe. And we went in and sat in a booth, and he came in carrying a stack of vinyl up to his chin and put it on the table. And I almost had a cardiac arrest. And I said, "I can't, so great to meet you. Thank you so much for bringing these records." And he said, "Actually, if you can help me out, I got the rest in the truck." And we went out, and he had a big black Suburban, and he opened the back doors, and it was filled with CDs and albums. And we helped him, he said, "Before I met Kathleen, these were all in pizza boxes." And we carried them in, and we sat in that truck stop diner in that booth, and he just went record by record. It was an unbelievable experience, and it went on for over 3 hours. Just incredible.
That's an amazing story. So then how did you end up with building your own music label?
The Hear Music label, I think it really, the Etta James collection that I talked about earlier, a lot of that music had come from a record label called Concord Records, which was run by a great, and is still run by a great man named Glenn Barros. And we sold some unbelievable number of Etta James compilations in 3 weeks. And so we had a conversation about, what if we actually went and, because we had this, as we said, unique ability to sort of play music for 60 million people a week and have the record right there. What if we went and found an artist? And the artist that we found was Ray Charles, and created the Hear Music label and launched a new artist. And I was thinking we would be finding, upstart singer-songwriter, but it was the greatest legend of them all, Ray Charles. And, he wanted to do he had been dropped by, I think, Universal. He'd been passed on by all the major labels. Imagine that. And what he wanted to do was a duets record. And now I think it seems like, you know, Lady Gaga and Tony Bennett do a duets record every 4 minutes. But at the time, there had been a very legendary one done by Frank Sinatra, but that was really sort of it. And, you know, he was saying, I want to sing with Norah Jones. I want to sing with Elton John. I want to sing with Diana Krall. And so we did it. And it was an incredible year of doing the recordings. We did not know it at the time, but he was dying of liver cancer. And it's the same time that Taylor Hackford and Jamie Foxx were making the film Ray. And, you know, I remember being at, you know, all of the recordings. I loved, there was one with Willie Nelson where they recorded it on the Eastwood Soundstage at the Warner lot, which is, you know, you see that at the Grammys where there's the big, or the Oscars where there's the big orchestra there. And then there's sort of isolation booths and they can score a film. And an incredible setting. And they had Willie Nelson in one booth and Ray in the other, and this giant orchestra. And, you know, it's, you can picture, right, Willie Nelson singing, when I was 17, it was a very good year. So it's this wistful song. And it was an incredibly emotional experience. And, you know, the last recording he ever made was with Elton John. Sorry seems to be the hardest word, and Elton was recording an album, and they set up the studio across the hall and brought in Ray from the hospital and recorded it. So it was an unbelievable experience. And then he passed away, and that album won. It was the Adele of that Grammys, right? It won 8 Grammys, Record of the Year. The Norah Jones song with Ray won Song of the Year. That was a pretty good way to launch the Hear Music label that you could never follow up on. We did release, as you mentioned at the top, Bob Dylan's Live at the Gaslight, which are the Gaslight recordings that had been around on bootlegs but never released. And we did a record with Herbie Hancock where, you know, it was sort of a duets record, but it was more than that. He went into the studio with John Mayer, whom he'd never met, and they wrote a song on the spot. That was pretty incredible. So it allowed sort of albums that might otherwise never have happened to happen and to get a broad audience. And that was really satisfying.
So what was the next step in kind of the evolution of your journey through this time?
So the next, I mean, I could talk about all the great stuff at Starbucks forever, which was an incredible company. And I got there when there were 1,100 stores and left when there were 10,000. I don't know what the numbers are, but I was there during this incredible period of growth. One day, Howard Schultz called me up and said, Bono is coming tomorrow. And they won't tell us why the people won't tell us why he's coming. So, you know, I should be in the meeting because it's probably about music. And I, of course, thought, you know, arrogantly thought, oh, of course, U2 must have a new record, and, you know, we'll do an artist choice with U2 and Bono and it'll be great. But that is not what the meeting was about. It was, he was at the very beginning of creating Product Red, which was his organization to fight AIDS in Africa. And at this point, you know, I think Product Red, to your listeners, you know, most of what your listeners are wearing gives back to some brand in some way. It gives back to some cause, you know. So from the remove of 2020, Product Red can seem pretty, I don't know, trite, but at that moment, it was a really incredibly innovative idea. Howard had actually had sort of an offsite a few months prior to that where he talked about how customers were going to do an audit of the businesses the companies they did business with. But at that point, so much of what companies thought about was having a corporate social responsibility tab on their website about what their foundation was doing. And it didn't get into the dialogue with the customer. It didn't get into the brand itself. And so Red was this ability to, you know, Bono's, you know, idea was this is an emergency And it's an emergency, not just of raising money, but of helping people understand what's happening. And so we need the best, in his words, the best storytellers in the world to help do that. And I think it's to his credit that he would then say, and some of the best storytellers in the world are Steve Jobs, Phil Knight, are these incredible brands. And if we could sort of hijack their marketing in a way that that communicated what's going, what this emergency is in an empowering way, and made it really simple to make a difference. And so I was completely blown up. He basically said, "I'm flying up the coast. 2 nights ago, I was with Steve for Apple, and I got him. Last night, I was with Phil Knight with Nike. That's how he says Nike, and I got him. And now I'm here for you. And I was absolutely blown away by the idea. And he also talked about, we're going to have the most creative people in the world work for the poorest people in the world. So that wasn't just sort of Nike and its agencies, that was musicians and artists and writers and actors. And I really loved that idea. And so eventually I left, and while we didn't do the Starbucks deal at that moment, I did leave and join Product Red, which at that point was very small, and a very small number of amazing people, as you mentioned, Bobby Shriver, Sheila Roach was one of the most amazing people ever that made it happen. And we were able, this tiny group of people were able to sort of have the fulcrum of these giant brands to launch a brand, on their backs. And that's a really tricky thing too. Steve Jobs was I can't have the Apple logo have parentheses around it. There is no way I'll let that happen, but he let it happen. And it was an incredible experience.
And you were able to bring in a whole new generation of artists in the process.
Yeah. I think, when we launched on Oprah, there was a big Oprah show where we launched, and Bono and Oprah went down Michigan Avenue. I was in the Motorola store with Kanye West, presidential candidate Kanye West. But I think we did create a way for musicians to turn their concerts red. We created a thing called Redwire, which was a subscription music service that was essentially like getting a mixtape from Red every month with exclusive. So you would get an exclusive song from Coldplay or Jay-Z, and then an emerging song that you wouldn't have otherwise known about, and some other piece of content that would help you understand not just the AIDS crisis, but the cultures of Africa that you were helping. So we were helping you understand that's a real, anyway, helping people really get a vision and understanding of the people they were helping.
So what did you do after Product Red that sort of was the next step in your curation and discovery and community process?
I went back to I loved Product Red. I did it for 5 years, but I wanted to get back to curation and discovery of culture. And so I created a company called Milk, MILQ, with two co-founders, Jordan Jacobs and Tomi Poutanen. And it was really, that's the company out of which we're sort of creating Hark. But Milk was really saying, okay, we're now at a time where now we have the internet, unlike your music, right? You can share any digital content, any culture, a song, a film clip, anything. And yet the way we're sharing on social media right now feels like we're atomizing culture as opposed to organizing it. And so Milk was about finding a way to sort of allow people who love and have knowledge about certain areas of culture, whether it's 60s film, whether it's film noir or tennis, to be able to share with each other in a way that sort of maps that area of culture. And we launched a consumer business. We powered a book discovery experience for Barnes & Noble. We developed an AI algorithm that we spun out and sold to TD Bank about 1.5 years ago, which was very successful for everybody. And then I really wanted to turn my attention to, specifically solving the issues around podcasts.
Why did that come about? Do you feel like the same barriers exist for podcasts as well?
So I see a great sort of rhyme, between the issues of around music and the issues around podcasting. I mean, first of all, podcasting is one thing is I love podcasts. And part of what I love about podcasts is what I love about music, right? What I love about music is there's an incredible array of artists, of incredible diversity out there. And yet the music industry feels like it's about, self-fulfilling prophecy of a bunch of music that sounds similar, and the same sort of star system being recirculated. And in podcasting, it's that times a billion, right? What we love about podcasting is the means of production have been handed to the people, right? So there's an incredible diversity of voices talking about a truly infinite array of topics. And there's incredible content out there. And so we want to tap, I want to tap into that. And yet the tools that I'm given are, the current apps are sort of here. I've subscribed to 6 podcasts and those episodes pile up, sort of like New Yorker issues I haven't read yet. Which is not to say I don't love those episodes, but what I feel, and as I've talked to other people who love podcasts feel, is there's so much out there and it doesn't feel like podcasts are browsable. What I want is sort of a prism that would refract it for me, like, so I could sort of tap into the genius conversations that are happening out there.
That's a great idea. There's such a volume and there's no way to curate it at the moment.
Exactly. And so I think it's a big problem for listeners. I know it's a problem for listeners, but it's also a really big problem for podcasters, because it means that it's very, the Apple podcast chart is a self-fulfilling chart of its own, right? We can people will keep listening to The Daily, or Joe Rogan and not get beyond it. And so the question of sort of how to solve that, though, it's different than music, right? With music, there was actually a really interesting podcast last week. The Andreessen Horowitz podcast had the head of R&D for Spotify on, and he talked about how, and Spotify has made a major push on podcasts. And he talked about how with Spotify Discover for music, you can, they give you a bunch of songs you've never heard of, and people skip the song within 2 seconds, like, nope, nope, nope. And you can do that 10 times and then get to a song that you might like. But with podcasts that are, and he said sort of with podcasts that are 90 minutes long, you can't sort of needle drop into the beginning and understand exactly what it is that quickly. And so I think we need to take if what we're going to do is create a serendipitous way for a broad audience to find their way to podcasts they otherwise might not have discovered, I think we need a different model than that. And so the idea for Hark at its simplest is to go and find those great moments within podcast episodes. So, you talking to Nina Totenberg about how as a young girl, she loved Nancy Drew and how that inspired her to become Nina Totenberg. And there's tons of examples, right? Of like when we find ourselves telling people, like all of you podcast listeners, right? I have that moment where I want you to listen to the whole episode, but you got to hear this one moment, right? That one moment is sort of the genius thing that will be their way in. So the idea of Hark is, what if we could create an entire immersive listening experience out of the best moments from great podcast episodes, where we organize those moments into, yes, mixtapes, because what else would it be after listening to me for an hour? And that would do sort of 2 things at once, right? So we could have mixtapes on all different topics, musicians telling the story behind their song, or what are different perspectives on Amy Coney, what are the likely policies of Amy Coney Barrett, or different versions of a history of the civil rights. Like, think of all the beauty of podcasts is all of the perspectives and the ability to create a mixtape that allows you to hit play, walk your beagle, and hear it move from moment to moment and clip to clip. But at the same time, so you can listen to it the same as you listen to podcasts. But what's beautiful is each of those moments is an invitation to go listen to the whole episode, discover the podcaster that made it. And so you start from sort of being dropped into an amazing moment, and you end up discovering a voice you might never otherwise have found.
I want to circle back to the beginning here, looking back on sort of the mixtape of your life and that young man who was creating mixtapes in high school. What would you say to that young man about this journey that you've been on?
Well, I certainly didn't think it would have anything to do with anything I would end up doing. And so I think the number one thing I would say is, find a way to keep pulling at the threads on this sweater, keep doing the things you love and finding ways to apply those to what you want to do in your life, and that you feel like can have a meaningful difference. So I feel very lucky that something I loved doing when I was 15 ended up, being something that I could try to apply to what I wanted to accomplish, right? And what I wanted to accomplish was have other people have that incredible experience of discovering an artist they may otherwise, discovering Ale Farkature, finding themselves listening to a Malian blues guitarist and loving it because Ry Cooder helped you understand how to appreciate it. Similarly to with Hark, finding yourself listening to an incredible discussion of the Lascaux Caves by John Green from the Anthropocene Reviewed, because you found your way there through a mixtape on Hark. So I would, that to me is like why I feel lucky that I fell in love with the right hobby way back then.
So, this year has been such an extraordinary one in our history with COVID-19 upending our lives, and now this historic election. Have you had any, what I call viral insights from COVID-19, that moment of clarity brought upon by a crisis?
It's been such a tragic year on so many levels, not just COVID-19. I think COVID-19, all of the social justice, just the travesty of George Floyd, and then the incredible partisan divide are the things that, I think having those things happen in a world where COVID was happening, which meant that some people were holed up in places of comfort and some people were not. I think, again, really, COVID has shown us that we are not all living in the same America. And George Floyd has showed us that we're not all living in the same America. And I think I don't know that it's an insight, but it's an imperative of what can possibly help bring America together. And another thing I work on is I created a website for Ken Burns called Ken Burns Unum, which essentially is allowing Ken Burns to sort of create mixtapes of moments from his films around themes where he's trying to help you to see a moment from our history and how it applies to now. For instance, an interview he did with James Baldwin around the Statue of Liberty and how it relates to Confederate monuments. And, my hope is that we can find a way. The thing that feels so powerless is how paralyzed we are and how we're not talking to each other, and different parts of America are consuming fundamentally different media. And getting fundamentally different perspectives. And one of the things, to bring it back to Hark, is I do think what's powerful about it is we feel like we're creating a new medium. There isn't a place where you can hear a playlist of short clips from different perspectives on one topic. And I'm not saying that's all of what Hark is, but I think as we've started to, wear the sweater and try out the elasticity of this format, that's what's been the most powerful, of trying to create something that actually isn't just one perspective or another, but brings those voices together. And I'm not saying I think it's a silver bullet to solve the problem in America, but that's not so much an insight, but as a concern.
That's great. Well, Don, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I love your show.
Don McKinnon is the CEO and founder of Hark, a podcast discovery, curation, and community building app that's launching tomorrow to help listeners discover podcasts that they otherwise might never have found. Thanks for listening to the 52nd and final episode of Season 2 of When It Mattered. I'm really looking forward to bringing you Season 3 in the new year. We have some great guests lined up, and they'll be sharing amazing stories that will inform, delight, and inspire you in your own journey as leaders. This is When It Mattered. I'm Chitra Ragavan. Thanks for listening to When It Mattered. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast platform. And if you like the show, please rate it 5 stars, leave a review, and do recommend it to your friends, family, and colleagues. When It Mattered is a weekly leadership podcast produced by Good Story, an advisory firm helping technology startups with strategy, brand positioning, and narrative. For questions, comments, and transcripts, please visit our website at goodstory.io or send us an email at podcast@goodstory.io. Our producer is Jeremy Kaur, founder and CEO of Executive Podcasting Solutions. Our theme song is composed by Jack Yeagerline. Join us next week for another edition of When It Mattered. I'll see you then.